Welcome back to Clarkston Lighthouse Guidance. My name is Chandler Fleming. I'm the host of the show, along with my wife, Victoria.
Hi, I'm Victoria Fleming, and I am co-owner and therapist at Clarkston Lighthouse Counseling with my husband. Today, we are going to talk about a very important topic, and it is the topic of forgiveness, living healthy. And the reason we called it Forgiveness, Living Healthy, is the impact of unforgiveness can have significant negative impact on our lives. And so we really wanted to touch on this very important issue of forgiveness, because you cannot live in this world without being hurt in some way.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So,
you know, one of the things my brother always used to say, and I don't quote my brother a whole lot, but and it's kind of a terse kind of comment, but he always said people are jerks. And then he went and said, you know what, there are times that I'm a jerk. Living in life, it's messy. There are problems. We step on each other's toes. Sometimes we intentionally step on other people's toes because we're angry or frustrated or whatever. So, you know, the topic of forgiveness will interject itself into all of our lives.
Absolutely, because there's not, like I said, a one of us who have not been offended or hurt in some way, shape, or form. So as we're looking at this topic of forgiveness, let's first define what forgiveness is. And forgiveness is a decision, is an actual voluntary decision that a person makes. So it's a conscious, deliberate thing to let go of feelings of resentment or anger.
Yep.
Toward a person or a situation. So I think a very key part of this is that it is deliberate, that it is a decision to release those feelings of resentment and anger toward a person or a situation in your life. And as we look at it, I know that you had a great example working for one company of what forgiveness is.
Well, you know, working for the company, I like to think about forgiveness in financial terms. I think it works best. Oftentimes in counseling, I'll ask somebody, have you forgiven yourself or have you forgiven that person? And they'll say, well, sort of, I think, I don't know. So my definition of forgiveness in counseling is you no longer expect payment back. If I borrowed or if I lent somebody $500 and they didn't pay me back, forgiveness is saying I no longer expect them to pay it back. Now, how does that apply to a company? The company I worked with, sometimes people, they were late on their payments or, you know, they owed us money and it was a small amount of money. And a lot of times we ask, why are we not going after those dollars? Well, the reason being was by the time you wrote a letter, put a stamp on it and so forth, it was costing $5 or $6 just to send out the letter. So in that process, you got to ask yourself, what is it costing not to let it go?
And I appreciate what you're saying, that we have to look at, and you said they were small amounts, and so if a lot of energy has to be invested into exacting that payment, then you have to ask, what is the cost? And studies show that when it's not in financial terms, but in forgiveness terms, that people who have unforgiveness have increased pain. They have higher blood pressure. Their immune system has a reduction in its ability to be able to fight off germs. There's an increase in depression, in anxiety, in sleep disturbance, plus many others. I mean, there's digestive issues. And so when you look at the cost of unforgiveness in a person's life, it is a significant cost. Don't know of any of us who are wanting to have sleep disturbance, who are wanting to have digestive issues, who want to increase our depression, increase our pain, have heart issues. So when we look at it, we're actually looking at the fact that the person who is the prisoner to unforgiveness is you.
Yep.
The prisoner is me. If I choose not to make that decision to forgive, to consciously decide to release those emotions, then I'm the prisoner. I am the one who is suffering from the cost of exacting payment, of looking for a way to make it right, of looking for justice. And so I think it's super important to look at, why do people sometimes choose not to forgive? And I think part of the reason is people have a misconception about forgiveness. So let's take a look at what forgiveness is not. So Chandler, as we look at what forgiveness is not, what are some aspects that forgiveness is not?
You know, one of the major things I think is forgiveness is not making an excuse. is not saying that that behavior was okay or accepting the behavior. It's not excusing the person's thing. Forgiveness is recognizing what took place was wrong and moving on and letting go of it.
Mm-hmm. And I really appreciate the fact that it is not condoning or excusing the wrong.
Yes.
It's not forgetting and acting like it never even happened. And it is not a required reconciliation with the person, because I do think that very often people feel like it's a high five. It's a pass on, you have done something, and we're not talking just necessarily a hurt feeling or an accidental stepping on toes. We're talking about some things that are extremely painful.
Yeah.
You know, there was actually a big study that was done on survivors from 9/11. And they took a look at, like, how do you do the, I have been egregiously wronged, I have been grossly wronged, was going about my day and this terrible thing happened. And yet as they were studying some of the survivors, some of the families that were impacted, it was important that they noticed that the individuals who made a conscious decision to release the feelings of anger toward the situation, toward what people, representative people were involved, were the ones that did so much better. They did so much better.
Sure.
So we're definitely not talking about situations where it is just light. There are those of you who are watching this show who've had a tremendous wrong done to you. You've been caught up in a divorce that you did not want. You've been violated in a way that was beyond your control. And yet, even in those situations, the studies clearly show that making that decision is vitally important. So when we're looking at required reconciliation, what does that mean to you?
I think it's one of those situations where you believe that you have to make the situation right, that you have to find justice in the situation, and that's just not the case. There are some things that are misunderstandings, and there's some things that we just have to build acceptance with. That 9/11 example is a big one, where how do you come to reconciliation with that? Just through acceptance. Mm-hmm. You're not going to talk to the people in the plane or find meaning in it other than building acceptance for it.
Right. And say, for example, a spouse who has had an affair and it has resulted in a divorce that you in no way wanted. Forgiveness does not mean required reconciliation, meaning that you are going to become friends with that individual again, that you are suddenly going to be, I appreciate you as a person and I think you're terrific. It doesn't mean that at all. So I think it's important for us to recognize what forgiveness is not. You're not excusing the person, you're not condoning the person or the situation. You're not acting like it never happened. There are some things that happen that there are going to be consequences that impact you for the rest of your life, and you're not suddenly becoming bosom friends with an individual. So as we look at what it is not, let's look at what it is. When we forgive someone, what are we doing, Chandler?
Well, I think we're letting it go. We are saying that I'm no longer going to look for repayment, mm-hmm. that it's no longer part of my life. I remember one time when I was really angry with a coworker, and my boss said to me, you're giving them free space. I didn't have a clue what he meant. And he said, you know what? There's a part of them that you're carrying around in your mind that is giving them free space, and they probably don't even know it.
And isn't that the hard part? They may not even know it. We're walking around with this, like you said, like they have rented a space in our brain where we are so angry and so frustrated, and we may even think of that individual on a daily basis. And yet that individual may be going about their lives and not even be aware at all, may not care at all that they have offended you and significantly impacted your life. So a question becomes do I want to be a prisoner in my own mind and rent space to this person?
Yeah.
And I think something that's interesting too is you had an example when we were talking about the show about the young man who had been lifting weights and thought, if I can only, could you tell about that?
Sure. I worked with a kid, he was about 16 years old, and I saw him right after he beat up his father. His father was not the nicest man that I could tell, and based on the history, the father was physically abusive towards the mother. So this kid at 13, he started lifting weights, and he got really strong, and it was his motivation. Every day he lifted weights, he thought about his father. Well, when he turned 16, he was quite a bit bigger than his father, and he beat his father bloody. And I said, how did that feel? And he said, you know, it was the most empty experience of my life.
And that's so sad
It didn't
because, like you
change
said,
anything.
at 13, he starts lifting weights. So
Yep.
for 3 years, you can just imagine this kid pumping iron. And
Sure.
when I get big enough, I'm going to pound my father. So 3 years pass. He's finally big enough. He gets to do what he thinks is going to balance the scales. It's going to be justice. It's going to be payback. And you said he said it was the most empty
Yep.
experience of his life. And I think each of us, I can think of people who have thought, if I could just look them in the eyes and say, what you did was so
Sure.
wrong and you owe me. And I can think of one situation where the woman said, and the individual looked at me and said, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Sure.
And she thought, here I've been carrying this for all of these years, and I thought if I could just tell them. And then the individual looked and shrugged and didn't have a clue. And so again, a lot of wasted space and a lot of wasted time and energy. So let's look at, so obviously the cost is very high. You know, if you are holding bitterness, if you're holding anger, it makes my muscles feel tight thinking about it. So
Yeah.
that does increase the pain level. So let's look at the benefits. What are the benefits of making that deliberate choice? Not because what the person did was right, not because it's excusable, but because you have decided, I don't want to be a prisoner anymore. I don't want to rent space in my mind to that person anymore. And so the Mayo Clinic, among other, there are many, many studies that talk about the benefits of forgiving. Some of those benefits of letting go of grudges, letting go of bitterness, and choosing happiness, health, and peace are that you will have healthier relationships. You will have greater spiritual and physical well-being. Your anxiety, stress, and hostility will decrease. Your blood pressure will lower. You'll have fewer symptoms of depression, a stronger immune system, improved heart health, and a higher self-esteem.
Right.
That's an incredible list of
Lots of
things,
benefits.
a lot of benefits. And so let's look first at the healthier relationships. I know of situations where, say, a divorce has happened, and particularly if it is a bitter, contentious divorce, where one person wanted it desperately, may have acted out in inappropriate ways, the other person did not, and there are children involved. Chandler, can you think of some ways the children are negatively impacted if the wronged person in this divorce holds on to unforgiveness?
Oh, sure. I mean, a lot of times we think that it's not visible, that somehow we're keeping it to ourselves. But the kids will recognize that there's this hostile feelings, that there's this pain that's going on. So it carries over to the kids. Sometimes we're not good at hiding it. And a lot of people use their lack of forgiveness to justify bad behavior. Do you know what your father did? Did you know what your mother did? And keep the war going on. So, and oftentimes that anger and that hostility that they're hanging on just poisons their kids.
Absolutely. And you can even see that in work situations where maybe a person is very angry at their boss and they're poisoning every time they go to get a cup of coffee, every time they're talking to their coworkers. And those relationships, the coworkers are actually going to get so they don't want to go to the coffee station when the unforgiving person is there. So in looking at the benefit of letting go, healthier relationships, we don't want children who are in a shared custody situation to be a rope in a tug of war.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah.
You know, we want them to be in a healthy, happy environment.
Oh, for sure.
You know?
And unforgiveness basically is a lie. It is this lie that somehow by hanging on to the past wrong, that there's going to be some improvement in the situation. And that's rarely the case. Hanging on to it doesn't protect, and justice is rare. And sometimes we just have to build acceptance for.
Mm-hmm. We have to forgive the debt, like you said.
We have to forgive the debt. One of the things that, and this to some of our younger viewers, it may not have a whole lot of meaning, but I love the scene in Forrest Gump, where she picks up the stones and she starts throwing them at the house. Mm-hmm. And Forrest Gump says, you know, sometimes there's just not enough rocks. You know what, we can work and try to get that situation, get that anger out and to try and let go. But throwing rocks doesn't change the situation, doesn't change the past. Mm-hmm. Making that decision to let go and move on is hugely important.
And I actually like the example of the throwing rocks, because I think that the throwing rocks cannot fix the situation, but a person in their choosing to let go may need to go to that place where they were desperately hurt, and they may need to pick up those rocks, and they may need to hurl those rocks and say all of the things that have been pressed down and never let go. And you know, Jenny could have gone and Forrest could have sat beside her, and they could have thrown those rocks, and they could have said all of those things that needed to be said, but with the attitude that when the last rock is thrown, I'm choosing to walk away.
Right.
I'm choosing to be done with this because I want to have healthy relationships. I want to have a healthy life.
But also, you know, you got to define what throwing those rocks are. And picking up a rock and throwing it at a building, you know, maybe where they were, you know, they weren't going to get arrested and get caught. But too often throwing rocks is throwing those insults and those hurdles, those negative things towards other people. And there's sometimes a consequence. We oftentimes, out of a sense of unforgiveness or righteousness or whatever word we want to assign to it, throw rocks at other people, and the damage is big. You know, throw your rocks carefully.
Absolutely. So some healthy ways that we could possibly throw rocks would be, you know, you write a letter, and it's an unfiltered letter, and it's a letter that you know you are never ever going to send, but you write it. And again, I said unfiltered, where you're not worried about the grammar, you're not worried about the language you're using. It is just a cathartic way to throw a rock that's not going to get you in trouble. And you may need to write that letter over and over and over, and I think you'll find over time that the letter begins to soften and the wrath. But the goal again needs to be that after so many times, okay, I've given myself a chance to process and I'm going to move on. You know, another way to throw rocks is to have that safe person, you know, to be Jenny and have a Forrest where you can just rant and rave and say, at the top of your lungs, but again with the goal of, and when I finish, I'm going to choose to lay this down. You know, some people, as an act of letting go of their unforgiveness, will actually have a symbol, you know, an actual bonfire, but they'll take the pictures, they'll take those things that are painful reminders, and very deliberately, one by one, with the goal at the end of when the fire's done, my wrath is done, my need for justice is done, because again, I want to live healthy and I want to have healthy relationships, and I don't want the people around me to suffer because of my need for vengeance, for my need to make the person pay, when, as you pointed out, the person may not be paying at all. So as we look at this topic of forgiveness, we need to stop and ask, do I have an area in my life? Is there a person that I just keep holding on? And I think you and I in session can say we've met people who've been holding on to grudges for 20 years, maybe more. And just ask, do I need to let go? And take a look at how your life may be negatively affected because of a situation or a person that you have refused to just let it go, to make peace with it. As we look at that, what are your concluding thoughts?
You know, one of those concluding thoughts is oftentimes you can't even remember what the conflict was about, and those feelings get amplified over time. Forgiveness is a choice. It's not an easy choice, and it can be a series of choices, but make that first choice. Look at what are those things that you can do to not pick it up every morning, to compartmentalize it. If you have a really hard time of letting go, put it in a box. Put symbols in that box, but also figuratively put it in a box and look at, hey, you know what, I'm not going to think about that all day. Maybe the first thing in the morning, and that can be the first step. Limit the effect that it has in your life.
Oh, and I like that. Even give it a limited amount of time. And I appreciate what you said about that it may be a first step. You know, to use the cliche of the onion, very often forgiveness is so much like an onion, and that's been the experience in my life where I think I've forgiven and I've peeled off that first layer and I really feel at a better, healthier place. But then, I don't know, something happens, there's a trigger, and I have to do another layer, and then I have to do another layer, and then eventually I do get to the, you know, that core piece of the onion, and I'm in a much healthier place. So it's not necessarily a one-time fix.
Nope. And the other part of that is let go of the lie. Oftentimes unforgiveness is a lie. It says that if I hang on to this long enough, I'm going to get what I want. And sometimes there's no fixing, there is no getting what you want. You can't even define what that would be. And the lie oftentimes is, I have to hold on to this for my own benefit. The cost is way too high. And the only person you're punishing most frequently is yourself.
And I think a sad part of holding on to could be an illusion of control.
Yes.
You know, that there's a certain vulnerability of, and I've actually heard people say that, if I don't hold on to this anger anymore, I don't know what will happen. Well, I would encourage, give it a try. You know, my fist tight is taking energy. Try letting go of it and
Yes.
see if it doesn't feel a whole lot better. You know, be willing to risk that vulnerability. And again, appreciate that the studies show that people, even those, I think 9/11 is just such a great where completely innocent people's lives so powerfully affected, and yet those who did find some sense of resolution, some sense of, I'm not going to get the justice I'm looking for, so I've got to make peace with this and move on, are doing so much better than those who are still clinging
Yep.
to some sense of, I've got to get justice. And so forgiveness, just again remember that the benefits show, the studies show that people who choose, even years later, to forgive are healthier in every area of their life. They're healthier in their thinking, they're healthier in their relationships, they're healthier physically, the depression decreases. They've actually shown that people who choose to forgive, that some of them have gotten off of high blood pressure medication, you know, so the significance is just huge. I don't want anxiety in my life.
No, most definitely.
You know, I don't want to be hanging on to anything that's going to increase my stress. So our challenge today to you, for each one of us, is just please really look at who is the prisoner in this scenario if you choose not to forgive. It really is a gift for you. It
Yep.
makes you feel free in every way.
Yep, forgive and set yourself free. And that's most important.
Absolutely. And I love the visual that we have. Forgive and set yourself free so that you may be free indeed.
Yep.
So thank you so much for joining us for our show. Again, just take a look at your life. It's such a great opportunity to be set free, and we do hope that you have a wonderful week. Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching.
The views expressed in this show are for general educational purposes only and do not constitute professional advice on any subject matter, nor do they necessarily reflect the views or opinions of its guests or of Independence Television. If mental health assistance is needed, please seek professional licensed treatment.